I am joined by my dear friend, Dr. Trevor Stammers. Hello, Trevor.
Hello again, Andy. Hi, good to be back with you.
So we've talked on a few different subjects together. We've looked at the sort of the broad general idea of ethics and faith. Can they coexist? How do they coexist? How, as Christians, should we consider how they might work together? That was our first conversation. We've also looked at part of your own testimony, where I guess your beliefs on ethics would have been fairly tested on what do I really believe, because you lost sight in one eye and then a second eye, and then that eventually came back. But today we're going to cover a different topic. So just for people who perhaps have not seen either of the first two, just give us a little bit of an overview. What's your background when it comes to talking about ethics?
Okay, so I qualified as a medical doctor in 1980 and did postgraduate training in a variety of hospital jobs and became a general practitioner, which I did for around about 30 years. And partly as a result of the loss of sight, um, I switched to academia in 2010. And so I had a second career teaching medical ethics in a university in London for another 15 years or so.
So that's your background. Hence why we had a conversation around I mean, it was a very, very scratching the surface of the rudimentary basics of ethics against having any sort of a faith, but particularly around being a Christian. So that's something you, if I remember right, you actually taught like current, or was it current doctors or training doctors, or a bit of both?
Well, I was a medical teacher as well. I used to lecture at St George's Medical School, so I've had experience in teaching medical students over many years. But more latterly, quite a number of well, we had students from medical students right up to professors of medicine on the master's course, which I taught on and eventually directed over the years. So yeah, I've taught a lot of students over that time.
I thought it was just good just to get an overview, because we're going to be looking today at assisted dying and the whole topic around that. But I thought it was worth just making the point that you're not just somebody with an interest who has something to say. Actually, there's a lot of real-time experience of really people in difficult situations with their health, and yet you've been there as a general practitioner, and then in different ways further on. So I thought it was just good to cover that first. Just give us an overview then of the idea of assisted dying. What are we actually talking about here?
Right. Well, assisted dying, as the debate is usually framed, I think is a very, very confusing term, because although, as will become clear, for a whole variety of reasons, I am opposed to doctors supplying patients with drugs with which they can kill themselves, which is essentially what the law will permit if it's allowed in this country. That is not what I thought was meant by assisted dying when I filled in an online poll about it. So I found myself, in terms of the poll, voting for the very thing that I was against because of the imprecision of the phrasing. So I will very deliberately, for the rest of this interview, talk about assisted suicide, because sadly, that is what we are talking about. If we supply lethal medication to patients with the intention, at their request, albeit, that they take it when they decide that they don't want to live anymore, that is suicide. But in some countries, the legislation termed assisted dying also includes euthanasia, which is when the doctor themselves administers or the healthcare professionals, sometimes as nurses, administer the lethal dose. And it's very interesting that in a country like Canada, where both possibilities were introduced at the same time, the vast majority of patients request euthanasia. They want the doctor to do it, and we might well return to that. But in essence, assisted dying covers those two possibilities, but also, of course, assistance with the symptoms and the process of dying also is encompassed in palliative care. And that's where it gets very confusing, because it seems to me that better palliative care is very much what we need to try and avoid the very distressing deaths to witness that often I find fuel people's feelings that we need to change the law, but changing the law won't necessarily lead to less distress in dying, as we may come to.
Some of the things that immediately come to mind would be coercion and control. We're living in a world where domestic violence is very much still of the moment. I don't mean popular in a good way, but it's a very popular. We've got to be careful of this, and we've got to learn about this and safeguard against it and train people. But when we're talking about someone ending their life, what we're talking about is somebody who is clearly going to be vulnerable at that point in their life anyway, and at which point coercive control, which is a nice little buzzword, to say somebody else making us do stuff we don't want to do, that then is such a big danger, isn't it?
Yes, it's interesting. I spent most of my time at a recent rally outside Parliament in connection with this, talking with the opposite side. And I raised with them the issue that many patients in surveys in countries where this is allowed, an increasing number are requesting assisted suicide because they feel a burden. And it was interesting that many of them felt that was not a problem. If people feel a burden, then that's as good enough reason as any. And I found that rather alarming, because certainly in my time in general practice, I saw a few patients who did come to see me, sounding me out about whether I might be prepared to help them if ever it became allowed in this country, because they did feel a burden. And sometimes this is a true story. It's not typical of my practice, but I think one of the things in general practice is you do get to know your patients very well. And one lady who shared this with me, I said to her, "Are any of your relatives registered with me as well?" And she said, no, they're not. And I said, "Do any of them live nearby?" And she said, "Yes, some of them do." So I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you get them to register with this surgery, over a process of time, I will eliminate them for you so that you no longer feel a burden to them."
Wow.
And then I witnessed her eyes widening in alarm. And then I smiled. And I said, "You get my point, don't you? That, it takes a two-way communication to feel a burden." And she did continue to see me, but oddly enough, none of her relatives registered, but she never raised the issue with me again. I was still alive when I retired.
The first thing that I think I really wanted to ask you about, from someone looking at this from a non-medical background, we hear about the Hippocratic Oath. We hear about this thing that doctors, they're supposed to do good, not harm. We can come into whether it's harm or not in a minute, but what is the Hippocratic Oath? Because that seems to be something that I would immediately think, well, shouldn't that stop it?
Yes, I think, again, people often do refer to that, and the Hippocratic Oath does forbid the giving of a deadly poison, as it puts it. But we've been moving as a society away, and medical ethics have been moving away from the Hippocratic Oath for a very, very long time. And I think I'm right in saying that no doctor would these days in Western countries swear the Hippocratic Oath. A lot of patients think that we have, but I have never done it. My medical school didn't in the 70s. So that's largely mythical. But it is interesting that the Hippocratic Oath obviously predates Christianity. And right from the very beginnings of what we understand as modern medicine, the forbidding of intentional killing was right at the heart of it. And so it's only in the 20th century, really, that systematic moves have been made by very determined doctors who, for reasons of their own, have wanted to undermine that. That we've seen a big shift away from it. But most of the surveys that I used to support the idea that the majority of doctors support assisted dying, that's not really the case. I think doctors are divided, but most younger doctors a majority of younger doctors, that may be the case. But those doctors who are actually most concerned with the dying, that is to say, palliative care specialists, geriatricians, psychogeriatricians, and those caring for the mentally ill, I think are much more hesitant about it, and only a minority of those are in favor. So when it comes to polling and statistics, I think it's a very difficult arena on which to base legislation. You've got to look at the principles, and I think even more importantly, you've got to take a long, hard look at those countries that have already introduced it and see what is happening there. And frankly, some of those I find completely terrifying. Canada is the most particularly worrying example. And I think I'm right in saying that in the leading campaign to legalize assisted suicide in this country, they've removed all reference to Canada from their website. The last time I looked, that was the case. I may have said it so often on radio now, they've put something about Canada back again, but it's looking pretty bleak there to me.
Just because clarity is always a wonderful thing. So I've got some notes here, but so we've got assisted dying, we've got suicide, we've got euthanasia, and we've got palliative care. Can you just break those into something that's more simple for people like me who haven't got a medical understanding of this, or very, perhaps a televised version of medical knowledge? What are those different things actually talking about?
Right. So palliative care, doctors who specialize in palliative care, often as well as being experts in helping the symptoms of dying and relieving the distressing symptoms like breathlessness, sometimes nausea, and particularly pain. So they will make the dying process as pain-free as possible. And many palliative care consultants also work as pain specialists as well. But they also usually have a team working with them that can help with the psychological aspects of dying. And one of the really good books I would recommend to listeners is one that I read and benefited from when my own father was dying, and it's called With the End in Mind, and it's by Dr. Catherine Mannix. And she was a palliative care consultant for many, many years. And that book explains that in the vast majority of cases, dying is actually a very peaceful process. But of course, That's not always the case, particularly where palliative care is not available. And so I fully understand why witnessing a death of somebody in agony may and often is the experience of those who are passionately advocating for the other two things, which are assisted dying, which or assisted suicide, where a prescription for a lethal cocktail of drugs is given to the patient to have at home to take when they feel that they are ready to go. Or in some countries, euthanasia is also legalized at the same time, where the doctor administers the drug. Now, I should say that although in this country the campaigners are only pressing for assisted suicide, if you introduce that, you will automatically, if you're honest about it, have to make provision for people who are so sick that they cannot administer the drug themselves. And without the law being clear on what happens in those circumstances, where it seems to me that healthcare professionals will have to carry out euthanasia, people say, all we want is assisted suicide, for people to have that option themselves. But it will entail either openly and honestly admitting that we will have to have, in very few cases, euthanasia, or you hide that behind the screen. And sometimes, and this is well documented, it's not very common, but they've had years of experience now of assisted suicide in Oregon, the drug doesn't always work. So those on the other side who promise, or the celebrities particularly, who believe that, they will have an easy death, a pain-free death, a dignified death, whatever that means when somebody has decided to take their own life, because that in other circumstances brings huge burdens for other family members in its wake. And I can't see that necessarily that's any less with doing it whilst you have a terminal illness. It will mean in some cases that patients take the drug and they do not die. And there's one guy who recovered in Oregon. If you look at the reports, and they have biannual reports, I think it is in Oregon, he recovered some days later and said, where am I? And then died naturally sometime afterwards. So there's no absolute guarantee. And as much as I understand the desire for people to have control, and that's another issue, I think, that's a very strong motivator for many people who are campaigning for assisted dying. The idea that, I am the captain of my soul, the master of my fate, and I must have control over my death. Even if the law is changed, you won't necessarily get it, because nothing is certain in life except uncertainty. So I've thrown in a few other spanners there, as well as explaining the terms, but I hope that, the three different things can be distinguished, and it's important to distinguish between them, because otherwise we may find ourselves, as I said earlier, voting for something that's actually the opposite of what we thought it was.
I think it's interesting that the words are always clearly going to be used in different ways, but we think about the whole issue around abortion, and termination, that sounds somehow different to abortion, so we're going to change the wording. Actually, it's killing a child, but we don't want to say that, so we use words that somehow make it sound less unappealing than perhaps we want to think it is.
Yes, and those who are very pro what they would call assisted dying, if they if folks are listening. And so I do meet Christians who, professing Christians whose reality, whose faith I have no reason to doubt, who are swinging in favor of it. They will really find this very, very difficult to swallow. But I'm afraid it is true that whenever a move is made to legalize any form of involvement in the medical profession in killing, and that is what it is, not directly if the prescription is done, although as I've explained, more direct involvement even there may happen. To provide the means of somebody taking their own life will entail the amending of the Suicide Act in this country if assisted suicide is allowed, so that the two are very much intertwined. And this does touch on one of my major concerns, that there is no form of introducing medical killing that will not expand and extend. And when you look at all the countries that have introduced it for more than 10 years, or in the case of Canada, only just under that time, I think, you see that safeguards are not possible. And all the talk about it will only be limited to X, Y, and Z, whatever it is, over a period of time, that is eroded. And that is where, again, we see a common link with abortion, because what was intended to be in very strict circumstances is now being called for total decriminalization. And so we shall see, I think, at that end of the spectrum, it will be impossible to prosecute parents who have committed infanticide. That's a different topic. And I actually rarely speak about abortion at the same time as assisted suicide, because people on many other aspects do say that we are talking about a different thing. But in my heart of hearts, I do see that the two are very much linked in the way in which what was originally intended to be narrowly restricted inevitably expands once you concede the principle that the medical killing is permissible. And that's, of course, where, for Christian listeners, I would have to come back to one's reading of scripture, and whether you claim to be a believer who is seeking to live your life in the light of scripture, because the command that you shall not murder is, again, at the heart of both Judaism and the Christian faith. And murder is intentional killing. And if you look at suicide in the Bible, there are 6 or 7 cases of that, depending on whether you count Samson or not. The most famous one is Judas, of course. But in all of those instances, suicide is seen in a very negative light. Ahithophel's suicide being, in a fit of pique about his advice not being followed, and this, I think, is a consistent theme. One of the things that struck me with great force when I was debating this in Australia at a medical school there, just before the pandemic, in fact, was that one of their parliamentarians who was pushing for it, and it has been legalized in all the states there now, I think. He was claiming that Christians ought not to be opposed to it because Jesus himself had an assisted suicide. And he pointed to the end of chapter 19 in John's Gospel, where it talks about there was a jar of sour wine and they offered Jesus some of this on a stick on some hyssop. And as the parliamentarian put it, he drank it and committed assisted suicide by so doing. And this is just shows a complete sort of fabrication and misuse of the text. Jesus said to Pilate that he would have no power over him, that is Jesus, unless it were given him from above. And Scripture makes it quite clear in the very next verse, or the same verse that talks about the receiving of that wine, or at least the tasting of the wine that I will come to in a minute, that Jesus gave up his spirit. Nobody took it from him. He surrendered it and gave up his life. And I suspect that anyone who's cared for the dying and knows the importance of giving ice crystals and moistening the lips and so on, it may not even have been drunk. Just the moistening of the lips is very, very important in the dying process. But it seemed to me incredibly fanciful and quite ridiculous to construct a support from the story of the crucifixion of all things to justify what campaigners are calling for in the UK now.
I try not to make comments because I'm trying to draw out of you your knowledge, but that sounds like
it took me a while to process that one. I can tell.
Yes, no, Jesus did not commit suicide. Absolutely not. I can state that quite happily, because that. Let's move away from that one. Look at the Netherlands is a country that I would automatically think of. You talk about killing old people or euthanasia or whatever. I just think of the Netherlands, which maybe is a rather sad indictment on the nation, because I just think killing people, Netherlands. That's where my head goes, because I know of assisted dying, however they might want to nicely put it, but killing old people particularly, that's where I go to. That's in my head.
Well, the Netherlands was the first country to legalize, in their case, euthanasia as well as assisted suicide. And it is deeply shocking to see some of the things that have been happening there. I think Holland illustrates particularly well two areas of change. One is that inevitably the restriction of not allowing it on children gets lifted. And that same has happened in Belgium within a few years. They were permitting it for children. And of course, when you talk about autonomy, the line as to where personal responsibility and uninfluenced autonomy is with children, it can be extremely difficult. But even in adults, the extension to those with psychiatric and psychological disorders is equally inevitable, because once you allow the fact that physical suffering, whether it be terminal illness or not, and we might talk about that area in a moment or two, but once you allow it for intolerable suffering, then you cannot say to a depressed person who will rightly say that my mental suffering is just as painful and intolerable as your bone pain from cancer. So the logical thing is then to allow it for mental health problems alone, and that expands the numbers and conditions greatly. And how can you then, as a psychiatrist, know which of your suicidal patients who are coming to you you should help to overcome that and engage in suicide prevention, and to which should you offer assisted suicide as a way to escape it? And it's no surprise to me that one of the greatest champions against assisted dying in the United States is a consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Mark Conrad, and he is a very passionate advocate against it.
I guess one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about, just to explore slightly, was this idea of feelings, because we can feel this, we can feel that. And, you know, we can feel hungry when we're not, and that can change. We can feel sad because we need some sunshine. You know, there are some really, really rudimentary, simple parts of life where our feelings need to be kept in check. And I guess my concern about all of this topic is, at what point are we saying, well, someone's feelings that we know can change 20 times a day, why are we now saying that this particular feeling suddenly has sufficient credibility for us to say, yes, we acknowledge that you have no value of life, so yes, you can kill yourself? I suppose my biggest concern and alarm for this is along that sort of a question of not just the value of life, but feelings change. And in order to feel as though I want to kill myself, well, that feeling can grow and it can wane and it can come and go, but actually, at what point are we again going to say, yes, that feeling's now strong enough for long enough that, yes, you have a right to say you have, you know, a good mental health in order to kill yourself, when they're probably in the most depressed, mental health, unstable part of their life?
Well, that just opens another can of worms, of course. For most patients who are receiving assisted suicide in the countries that have legalized it, they do not have a psychiatric assessment. And so half the time you don't know whether patients have competency, mental capacity to give consent, and the way in which the whole process is trivialized in some countries is just chilling. I don't know if you saw that BBC documentary with Liz Carr, where she interviewed a doctor in Canada who had carried out over 800 euthanasias, and she was laughing about it. At several points, she just could not control her giggling and, to me, absolutely chilling way in which she answered the very probing questions that Liz Carr had asked her. So I think whether people are properly assessed or not, when in some parts of Canada, 7% of deaths, so that's sort of one in 15 is by euthanasia. The sheer numbers are just astonishing, and I think it just becomes a routine conveyor belt in that clinic from what I could see. But the other thing, of course, is that waiting lists for psychiatric treatment, even in Canada, are longer than the period of time it takes to get permission to be euthanized, or as it would be initially in this country, to receive a lethal prescription. So you can see where things are going in Canada, and those who cannot see it are willfully blind. But some of them will say, of course, that could never happen here. Well, I don't believe that at any time is it right for a country to legalize medical killing or medically supervised killing. But to introduce it into this country at a time when waiting lists in the NHS are at an all-time high, and it is extremely difficult to get appropriate and speedy medical care, but particularly for psychiatric illness, but also for many other conditions as well. It would be, I think, opening the floodgates, and we will deeply regret it. I think as quickly as many, but unfortunately not enough are in Canada. And a lot of doctors who are opposed to it in Canada have ceased to be medical practitioners. So I think, although some doctors will capitulate if it is legalized in this country, because it's hard to lose your job. And I think conscience rights will be eroded as quickly as they were in Canada. In fact, one judge in Canada, in his judgment, made the conscientious objectors to look evil doctors because they were depriving their patients of the right to this easy death. So things get inverted very, very quickly, and many doctors and nurses, and the importance of nursing care, I think, shouldn't be played here either, because many of the places where this has been introduced, the numbers are too many for doctors to cope with, so nurses are involved in prescribing and administering as well. It will change within 10 years the whole face of medicine in this country, as it has done so in many other countries. Australia is now beginning to go down the same way, and I can confidently predict it won't be long before the restrictions that are in place there, so that it's just for the terminally ill, are removed, and it will be offered for the psychiatrically ill children and so on there within a relatively short number of years.
Just bringing in my own.
It's terrible. It is terrible.
It's terrifying. Bringing my own experience of, I mean, okay, we're in the UK, we've got the National Health Service, but I've had heart problems for a year and a half. Sometimes I have palpitations. Sometimes they're so severe, I'm feeling severely depressed because I'm struggling to function. I lose a night's sleep. I lose 3 to 5 days. But at no point during that 18 months, however hard it is waiting for surgery to correct that, I don't then think, okay, I need to end my life because this is terrible. And then we're not talking about mild palpitations here. We're talking about palpitations that are enough that a consultant said, we really need to get you in hospital for heart surgery. We're talking severe palpitations. At no point have I thought, that's it, that's the end of my life. It's never going to get fixed. I've waited a year and a half for this. Yes, some of those thoughts might creep in, but switching this conversation slightly to our response as Christians, I then have hope that, well, it's okay if I die because I'm going to see Jesus. Yes, that's true. It's a hard kind of concept to think through, but I also think, but I don't want to die. Yes, this is miserable, but I'm still alive and I've still got breath. And that comes from a hope in a faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, which I think in all of this, in all the what word we're going to use, how we're going to do this, who's going to die, who's not, who's going to authorize it. The one thing that's lacking from all this conversation is hope.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, and the thought just struck me as you were speaking there, that for a variety of reasons, the eternal perspective that the Christian faith gives actually paradoxically gives me great hope in this life also, and also a reason to stay alive and not and not want to take my own life. Although in another story, I'm afraid I have been in that place as well, so I do understand it. But I do not think that the normal Christian experience should be one of hopelessness, let alone wanting to end your life. And part of that rests in the truth of the Christian message itself, I think, and its witness in Scripture. But a very important part of it also lies, I think, within the Christian community at its best. Now, that qualification has to be there, of course, because we all know that we're not always as affable as we are perhaps in this conversation online, and we can be unkind, but that's not the goal. And our sermon last Sunday morning, actually, in church, was on love is patient and love is kind. Just those two phrases, and that deeply impacted me. Because where patience and kindness are around, then fear and hopelessness is dispelled. And that perhaps rather naughty and provocative story I told earlier on, that patient got the message that, I wasn't wanting to kill her relatives, but was making the point in a way that I could, because I knew her quite well, that her feelings of being a burden were not, she was not necessarily to blame for them. And indeed, she wasn't to blame for them at all. And Paul tells us in one of his letters, Philippians, I think, that we were meant to be burdens to one another, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that's a great challenge. It can be very difficult to honor, particularly consistently, but that is what is there. And so, for me, the engagement in with people is a reason to rejoice and be hopeful, because Christianity shows us how things could be and guarantees that they will be for those who've put their trust in Christ, though we will have to wait for the complete fulfillment of it. But it's as sure as the fact that we're talking at the moment.
I want to move, because I want to have a good end and a good time for talking about this. But when we're talking about killing yourself, ending your life, terminating your existence, we're talking about trying to control your life in a way that actually we, as you've already explained several times, in different ways, in different elements, we don't necessarily even get, even though we think we should. I think of the number of people that jump off high bridges and live. I mean, this is their last thing. I'm going to kill myself, and they survive. Even when we think we're going to do something, we're not in control. But the scripture that comes to mind as I think about all this, and I quote this a lot at people, I paraphrase it, is that we're made on purpose and we're made with purpose. We don't necessarily immediately see that. We can see it better in some parts of our lives than others. We can have our highs and our lows, but actually, if God made us with purpose and on purpose, then we are valuable simply because. And when we think about the cross, Jesus did not commit suicide on the cross. Absolutely not. I'm laughing because I don't even know how to respond to that nonsense.
Yeah, it was pretty wow. Yeah, your point there, I think, is a really important one, and it's just reminded me of another story that I've never shared in an open way before, but I think One of the joys of retirement is that you don't particularly have a reputation to maintain, and you certainly don't have, a job to keep yourself in. And I remember at a time when I was at my lowest ebb, some of my colleagues in medicine at the time, who were the most marvelous bunch of folks to work with, suggested I took some time out. And I went to Lee Abbey down in Devon. I'd never been there before, and I had no connections with it. But a friend in Eastbourne, who was a medic who I knew quite well, did say that I could go and him and his wife, but I knew that Beachy Head was down there, and I didn't think that was a good idea. But I hadn't done sufficient homework to find out that Lee Abbey stands beside the highest cliffs in Britain. And on my way down there, I noticed that there were three, I think it must have been around about Easter time, they had three crosses up on one of the cliff tops. So I parked the car and I went up to have a look. And I stood on the edge of that cliff looking down at the water, literally under the shadow of those crosses. And I just felt the Lord say to me, I have been here so that you need not be. And I went back to my car and drove down the road to Lee Abbey, where the beginnings of my own journey back to healing began. So I would say to all those who may listen to this, if you want to die because you feel that you have no hope, for those who believe in the message of the cross and resurrection, there is always hope, because Christ has been there so that we need not. And you can trust him, even though his people may let you down. He will not. And most of the time, most of his people will be there to help you, as I discovered at Lee Abbey.
I suppose the biggest problem with a debate like this is you can have a polarized opinion of, yes, let's kill everybody that wants to die. That's great. As opposed to, no, all life is precious. Let's not do that. But in that conversation, that's kind of 1 + 1 = something. But actually, there's a bigger, more significant issue in all of that. Andy Hawthorne, in a MP's preface, I quote this frequently, talks about how the UK is shaking because we're taking Jesus out of society. So it's understandable it's going to shake because we're taking the foundation away. But in all these debates, actually, the one thing that is missing is it's not just about, should we let people kill themselves or not? Should we let doctors kill people or not? Should people have the right to end their life or not? Actually, there's a much bigger picture here. And it's all about the value of the individual, which is why I come back to what I just said before of, I believe we're made on purpose and with purpose, which means I have hope, and that hope wins and it trumps everything, because actually it's the most important conversation.
Yes, and I think just to tie it back into the topic we've been talking about, even beyond those who are unwell, either physically or psychologically, what we see in Canada shows that where society does not care, killing becomes a solution to other problems as well. And one of the most chilling stories there that was well covered in the press here was of the Paralympian Miss Gauthier, I think it was, who had requested a ramp for her wheelchair. She was offered assisted dying as an alternative, and there was a homeless man who was also offered it as a solution. Now, once it starts, as I say, it's very difficult to stop. And societal lack of care, the dismissal of certain sections of society as being unworthy of help, or at least unworthy of help that costs, they also become vulnerable. Now, I don't want to become over alarmist about that, because I think we still have the vestiges of Christian morality in a greater way than Canada had, but that capital will soon be used up if we are not careful. And so I think that the next 10 years for this nation is going to be crucial over this particular issue. And we still very much need those of us who believe in prayer and a God who answers prayer, pray for his mercy on our country, that we do not legalize this. We shall regret it.
What, because I want to get a sort of final comment from you, really, but what would be your message of hope to somebody who's thinking, do you know what, my life is really bad, I'm in lots of pain, I'm feeling depression, I feel a burden to society, all the stuff that we've mentioned in different contexts. What can you provide to that person that can say to them, do you know what, your life is actually worthwhile? I mean, from your own life, your knowledge of ethics, I mean, how would you speak into that life? I'm not after a soundbite, but just what would you speak into that person's life?
It's very difficult to do that in the abstract, but I think I can't say it, but I'm sure that for most people who have any connections with any other human beings, that point about you were meant to be a burden, and those people that rather than this guy talking on the radio, they love you and care for you more than you probably realize. So please do talk to them. And if there is absolutely nobody that you can turn to, then please do contact the Samaritans, do contact one of the organizations locally that is there and would love to talk to you on the telephone and befriend you, because the desire to die that is unshared and unspoken is the one that leads people to take their lives. Once it is expressed, that often is the beginnings of the recovery of hope. So I hope that's useful to anyone who happens to hear this broadcast.
Yeah, and I would say something along those lines of, if you're not quite sure who to talk to, find a church that's open every Sunday and go and talk to them. If it's open once a month, forget it. Go and find a church that's open every Sunday morning and go and talk to them and say, look, this is where I'm at. And I'm very confident you will get somebody who will actually listen to you. That's how I would usually phrase, where do you go? What church do I go to? If it's open every week, every Sunday morning, go and talk to them and present yourself. Trevor, thank you. I need to draw this to a close. It will fit within the radio show, but I'm really grateful for your time, your own personal knowledge, your professional knowledge, and how you actually tied this, because this is such an issue of this time that we need as Christians not to be afraid of talking about, but actually having a voice for this, because that, I believe, is what God has made us to be. We can get into social justice and all that, but actually speaking up for the most vulnerable, that's the example that I see in Jesus everywhere through the New Testament. His life walking on the earth, yeah, he did some amazing things, but the one thing that for me is the thread that ties it all together, he spoke up for the most vulnerable. And people who want to end their life, to me, they are the very most vulnerable people in society.
That's absolutely right. And that's why we do not need suicide to be assisted. We need it to be prevented.
Amen. Thank you so much for your time. I'm grateful as ever. I can sit and listen to you for hours and hours. I love hearing you, your knowledge, your love, your passion for the subject, whatever we're talking about. So, Dr. Trevor Stammers, thank you so much for sharing with us on what is a very difficult subject. And if you've listened to this and you're struggling with it, then please reach out to the Samaritans, as Trevor said, or wherever, or just find a church that's open every Sunday morning. Go and talk to them. Would be my biggest piece of advice for you. You are not alone. You never are. However you may feel, you're not alone. Thank you, Trevor.
Sure.
Did you know Pure 24/7 Radio has a shop? Well, we do. You can buy merchandise while supporting the work that we do here. Simply head over to www.pure247radio.org/shop. That's www.pure247radio.org/shop.